Hello, PLO order. Welcome to the latest episode. This time we're exploring calling stations and how to play versus those very cool happy players. We all know those, but how to make most money out of them. Let's get started. Calling stations. Well, the definition of calling station is probably well known to everyone, but let's wrap it up. They play a lot of hands, which means if you have a HUD or stats, they have a high VPIP. And then they are passive. They have very low pre-flop raise, very low tree betting. So if someone is stats are like 75, 50, 15, then I would consider those as aggressive or maniacs. But calling station refers to passive player who plays a lot of hands, and we can exploit him quite a lot. For calling stations, when they have a draw in hand or whatever hand, they are not interested in odds. They don't think about equities, probabilities, spot odds. They don't even know those. They might know the word, but they don't know how they work. For them, every draw is 50-50. It either hits or doesn't. So whether it's a wrap or gut shot, the calling station is only thinking, do I feel I'm going to hit it? And that's why they call with gut shots. Because they might hit it. And sometimes they do, and then they are happy. Calling station doesn't like to fold. It means he is looking, or her, or she, whatever, is looking for reasons to call. And we have two kinds of players mostly on small stakes. One is this type of player who is always looking reasons to call. He is always thinking, can I call? Why should I call? And then there are players who are always looking reasons to fold. And then those who are just trying to make plus EV decisions are the good players. But like 90% of players, they are biased towards either looking for reasons to call or looking reasons to fold. And if you can identify those players, it helps you to exploit them. And now calling station is always looking reasons to call. It means his calling range is super wide. One thing to mention is that calling station is not a fish. And my advice is never call that player a fish. Whether you talk with your friends, whether you make your own notes, whether you tell it to the player itself. Because fish is often used to describe a bad player. It's very negative wording. And when you say that someone is a fish, you kind of lift yourself above that player and you think he's a lesser player. And that's often ego talking. You think you are a better person than he or she. And if you have that negative idea of that player, then it's hard to play very optimally versus that player. Instead of thinking strategies, your ego starts to make decisions. And the thing is that if you say that someone is a fish, it doesn't describe anything. It's like you say that someone is a bad player. It doesn't describe how. Are they calling too much? Are they folding too much? Are they too aggressive? Are they too passive? Doesn't describe. You should think calling stations as good customers and treat them as good customers, because the fact is that on the small stakes, majority of your profits come from these players. You are not making your fortunes versus reps, where it's break even or even minus EV. You are not making your fortune versus nits, and sometimes you might be making fortunes versus maniacs, but your EV is better versus calling stations. And the variance is lower with calling stations, which means that these are your best customers. So when you have this kind of player on the table, he's like a gem. Take care of that player. Make sure he's happy on the table. If you don't normally chat with these players, you might want to chat and tell nice things to them. Nice catch. How you're doing. Whatever. Because if he likes to play or she likes to play with you, it means a lot of money for you. But if you tell that player that he's a fucking fish, get out, and he leaves, you just blew up a lot of money. But it all comes from the mentality. Don't think, oh, that sucker came on the table. Oh, he's a fucking fish. That's not profitable thinking. Let's do a SWOT analysis. SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then there's the typo, because my strength is not typewriting. But strength, well, almost put that they don't have strengths, but they do. They are bluff catching. Sometimes you see people bluffing a lot versus calling station, and they just keep calling, and suddenly they have 1000 BP stack. The weakness is calling too much, and that's a big weakness. That's what we're exploiting. The opportunities for you is to print money by value betting. Their opportunities, the only way they can win money is either get lucky and hit something, or some maniac tries to bluff them hand after hand after hand. But your opportunity is to make a lot of money by value betting. And the threat is, don't base your game plan on bluffing. And this is something that people constantly fall into. They think that, okay, his calling range is so wide that he can't call me 3 streets. And then we bet the flop, okay, we define his range. Wide range on the turn, he can't call, we put the turn, oh, he called. Well, river, he can't call with top pair. And we put, and he calls with top pair. So we defined his hand strength right, but we just tried to bluff. If you find yourself constantly in a situation on the river versus calling station where you have to bluff to win the pot, then you might want to reconsider your strategy, or at least evaluate what the hell is going on, because it's not the situation where we want to be. We want to be in a situation on the river where our decision is how much we want to value bet. And that leads us to value betting. When opponent is not exploiting us, we don't need to be balanced. And this is very important, not just versus calling station, but versus anyone, especially on the small stakes. Because with the solver strategies, everyone is going crazy about being balanced, using blockers to make plays, and so on and so on. Which is right if opponent can exploit us if we are not balanced. And it's good and right to know the strategy. Because then when you need it, it's better to know it before you need it than learn it afterwards. Or it's good to know what would be the balanced range, where's the threshold. So when opponent does something, you know whether he is to this side of the balance or this side of the balance, and you can start to exploit. But don't think you have to be balanced as an, can't find the word. Well, as a standard line, you always have to balance. Like normally we would check back top pair. Like, let's say the board is king 9, 5, and we have a king queen. Then on most situations we might check back if we have backdoors and stuff. And then versus these kind of players, we definitely want to bet it. So if someone says that you have to check solver checks that behind, then you can just say that opponent is not playing solver strategy, I'm not playing solver strategy. So don't think you have to play solver strategy, you have to play balanced. It's just one kind of strategy that we use versus certain type of strategy. Poker is always about exploiting. Either we exploit opponent or we prevent opponent from exploiting us. And therefore we rarely play solver strategy on purpose. So we versus calling station, who doesn't even know probabilities of anything, there's 0% chance he's ever going to exploit you no matter what you do. So you take balance and throw it as far as you can versus calling stations. No balance versus them, no whatsoever. If you ever think, if I do this, I'm capped. If I do this, my hand is face up. If I do this, I'm unbalanced. If your opponent is calling station, those thoughts in your head are going to prevent you from making money. And we're going to value bet a lot, as much as you can, as much as you dare. The concept you need to understand is that opponent's calling range is widest on the flop and tightest on the river, which means that on the flop he's going to call with almost anything that hits the board, even in some way, or he likes it at some way. On the turn, it's a bit more selectively, and then on the river, it's even more selectively. Like, he's not going to call you with flush draw on the river. He's going to call on the flop, most likely on the turn, but if he misses the flush, he's not going to call on the river. On the other hand, the pot is a bit less on the river too. So what we should do is we value bet a lot on the flop, and then more selectively on the turn and river. And that's like, from this video, if you want to remember one thing, is versus calling stations, the most important street is probably the flop. That's where you have to value bet a lot. But don't go crazy. Still, even when his calling range is super wide, you have to define the range and understand when we bet the turn, when we bet the river, when we check, and why. As a rule of thumb, on the flop, you can value bet top pair or better. That's often what I use. Or if you have a strong draw, just bet it. You're ahead in equities, you have huge implied odds, you often have some fold equity. But often top pair or better is good because they call with any pair, any draw. That's pretty much their calling range. But you don't have to bet the turn and river. Like king 9-5 flop, we have king queen, top pair, queen kicker. We bet the flop, he calls, turn doesn't help us, we check back, river doesn't help us, we check back, and we see if the king was good. And if it was good on the flop, then the value bet was good. Sometimes we win that showdown. So don't think that, okay, if we bet the flop, we have to barrel all the turns and fire all the rivers. No. Be selective. Like on the turn, we want to have high two pairs or better. Or top pair with awesome draws for value bet. And then river, definitely top two or better to think about value betting. So don't... The thing is, we want to make thinner value bets on the flop, but don't go too thin on the river. Like, sometimes I see people betting bottom two pairs versus calling stations. And the problem is that in order to value bet, you have to beat at least 50% of his calling range. And now, when opponent doesn't raise much, they can slow play nuts all the way. Then they are not capped, so the top of their range is actually stronger than versus better players who would raise strong hands. So the range is wide, but there's more strong hands in their range than probably versus better players. But then the distribution is that the strong hands is smaller part of their range. So in quantity, they have more strong hands, but overall it's smaller part of their range. I hope you understand this. Which means that on the river, we can't go too thin because they have strong hands. And we will talk about river value betting, don't worry. Opponent is very unlikely to raise or bet himself because he's doing that with only hands that he thinks or she thinks are strong enough. So if you have a strong hand or you have a potential hand, you need to start building up that pot. Never slow play versus calling station. And I'm trying to figure out, would there be an exception? But I can't come up because if for some reason you gain more value by slow playing, then he is not a classical calling station. Then we slow play to fight back aggression. And this guy has no aggression. So, no reason. So never slow play. Just go for pure value. And now the value of betting the flop is here. An example, heads up flop, pot is 8 pp's. Of course, hard to see. Well, button open, small blind calls, big blind folds, that's 8 pp. Often the pot is 8.5 pp's or 7.5 or something. But for clarity, now it's 8 big blinds. And then we hit the flop. We have a strong hand on the turn, and we can value bet the river. If we bet flop, turn, and river with 3/4 sizings, then the overall post-flop value is 58.5 big blinds. That's how much we get from the opponent if he calls flop, turn, and river. That's nice. But if we check the flop to induce a bluff, or we want to check backdoor pair to be balanced, whatever the reason is, and then we have a strong hand on turn and river, and we bet turn and river with 3/4, the post-flop value is 21 BB. So we are missing 37.5 big blinds when we actually hit strong enough to get 3/3 of value. And now if we think that, let's say our average win rate is 5 big blinds per 100, that's 37.5 big blinds is 7,500 hands that we have to play our 8 game to make up the fact that we missed a bet on the flop. So bet the flop. Because then if you have a strong hand on the turn, it goes exponentially higher. And as opponent is very unlikely to bet himself or herself or raise you, in order to make the pot big, you have to do the betting. Then a few words about bluffing. Wow. The number one rule in poker is don't bluff calling station. I don't think that's right. 100% right. And I see people bluffing calling stations way too much. So what? Now you're thinking that he says that we should be bluffing, and then he says we shouldn't be bluffing. Let me explain. When we bluff versus calling stations, we shouldn't have a strategy for true street bluffing. Either it's one and done, we stab the flop, or we stab the river, or we go for triple barrel bluff, if possible. Because if he calls the flop, it's very unlikely he folds the turn. That's quite often the case. So if we bet flop and turn and give up on the river, we're just weeding money away. So stabbing ones is good on the flops when we have blockers and enough fold equity. And now someone might say that you can't bluff because they're going to call with anything. They are not going to call with anything. They're going to call wide. But flops like 7-7, 3 rainbow, King 5 rainbow, monotone flops, those are the flops where we have enough fold equity to make a stab. 1/3 pot, half a pot. But 1/3, if he folds, god damn it, you have to be right 25% of times. So if you have more than 25% fold equity, you can stab. And he's not going to call with more than 75% of his range. 1/3 on monotone pots, half a pots. If you have blockers, increase fold equity. If you have equity versus his calling range, nice. If he calls, go to showdown, win every now and then. So we can stab those locked boards. But it's one and done. And then if we want to 3-barrel, it's with blockers, and often the only effective blocker versus these kind of players are the straight blockers. Like board is Jack 10-8, we have pocket 9s, where we are blocking all the straights, but we are not blocking all the straight draws. Bet flop, bet turn, and if the board doesn't pair or flush or make higher straight, fire the river, because they're going to fold a lot of their flush draws, a lot of their weak hands by the river, but not on the turn. Ace blocker to represent not flush, never. You can bet the flop on monotone board, but if he calls, he's not folding on the turn, and if he has a flush or set or straight, he's not folding the river. So don't try to make him fold a value hand that the player thinks is good enough, and thinking that he can't have the nut flush. Why did he call me with the straight? Why did he call me with 5-high flush? That's what they do. No. But on straight boards, they have 2 pairs, they have straight draws, they have flush draws, which they will fold on the river, maybe. Pay attention whether they do or not. If they don't, stop bluffing. And if at some point that player bets or raises you, respect. often the bet is something, and the raise is pretty much nuts or what he thinks are the nuts. Sometimes they might raise like a set on straight board because they think it's a strong hand. Who knows? But they don't raise as a bluff. Classical coin station never raises with a bluff, so respect the raise and consider that it's pretty much the nuts. Then life would be easy if every coin station would be 100-0-0, playing the same way, but no. Every player is different, and sometimes it's hard to say where the threshold is. Like, if opponent is 60-15-5, is that considered coin station? 75-20-10, is that a coin station? So it's impossible to say where the line is drawn. So every player is along the spectrum, and on the other end is 100-0-0, and on the other end is 100-100-100. So complete coin station versus complete maniac. And the closer they are towards the classical coin stations, the more you can apply the concepts that I'm describing here. But you have to think yourself. Every coin station has different coin ranges. And that applies to flop, that applies to turn, and that applies to river. And especially river is the interesting one, because if he calls with two pairs when you bet 3 street with straight blockers on Jack 10-8 board, make note, pay attention. Doesn't fold two pairs, probably doesn't fold sets. That's the player who calls rivers when the flush or straight is there, even with two pairs or sets. Because he doesn't believe, he doesn't want to be bluffed, or he thinks the hand is strong enough. Maybe he is a hold'em player. So then don't make those bluffs, just value bet as much as you can, and the money will come to you. Make notes about how wide he calls the flop. If he calls the flop, does he always call the turn? If he calls the flop almost always, then folds the turn very often, make notes. So the more you have notes, and the more accurate they are, the more you can exploit, because you understand how the opponent plays. And this is kind of player who doesn't change strategy. He has a certain way of playing and thinking, estimating things, that's how he plays. And if you can figure it out, it's like playing versus really bad bot. You know how he plays, you exploit him, rinse and repeat. Just execute the strategy. And the way you adjust is pretty much adjusting your value betting range. The weaker hands opponent likes to call with, the more you can start to value bet. And just think, where is the threshold? How wide I can value bet here? And in order to figure out the value betting range, you have to think about the opponent's range. Even when it's really wide, if you define his range, then on the river, you can estimate his calling range and then think how wide I need to value bet. But remember, in order to value bet, you need to beat over 50% of his calling range. And that's where softwares like PokerJuice comes really handy. Vision, Monker, they don't tell you this stuff, because that's certain strategy versus certain strategy. Perfect strategy with certain parameters. But now we're exploiting, so what you can do is go to PokerJuice, put the hand, give opponent range, pre-flop, flop turn, on the river, give him his calling range, and then you can see with your hand, do you have over 50% equity versus that range? And then you can change your hand and see what kind of hands, how weak your hand can be. As long as you beat over 50% of his calling range, you can value bet. So it's a skill itself to know how wide you can value bet versus calling station. So to wrap it up, most of your money versus these players. I would like to say 100%, but it's not, because we do definitely stab flops, and sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we have to bluff the river. But if it happens every now and then, and you understand that, okay, it's just very unfortunate run out or something, it's fine. But if you're constantly bluffing river versus these players, then reconsider. But most of the money, like 90% or more, comes from pure value betting. And remember that. The money doesn't come from bluffing. And in order to do that money, you have to value bet wide enough, way wider than versus normal players. And don't be afraid to bet fold reverse turns. We bet for value, but once he raises, the range is super strong. We can fold, unless we have hand that plays well against that range. And don't be afraid to make those thin value bets. Of course, in order to bet fold, we need to bet more thinly. So, like on the river, let's say that we have two pairs and we estimate, and then we back it up with poker choose analysis, and we see that, okay, we beat 60% of his calling range. So we can value bet. But 10% of that calling range or continuation range will raise because he has a strong hand on the river. So we beat 60% of his calling range, but then 10% of his hands is going to raise us. It's a spot where we are super happy to make the value bet. Once he raises, okay, we run to the 1/10 of his range. This time we fold. So it's like betting the flop. We know that on 7-7-5 rainbow, we can stab and we have enough fold equity versus passive players. But once they raise, we realize, okay, they have trips or better, we fold. Now that same concept is just applied on the rivers. We know that it's profitable to bet here, but when he raises, we're happy to fold. And don't fall into the trap that he shouldn't have the hand he's representing. These guys can slow play in weird ways. They can slow play super strong hands. I mean, I've seen Coin Station check top set to you 3 times. When you check back, flop goes check, check, turn goes check, check, river they check, and they have the nuts. So if the opponent is representing nuts on the river, then most likely he has it, no matter how improbable it seems. And make notes. The more you make notes, the more you can exploit. And we make money by exploiting. If you're not making notes versus Coin Stations, then you're giving up money. It's that simple. And remember, Coin Station is your best customer by far. When you have those on the table, be happy. That's where you want to be. Variance is low, profits are high. Couldn't get any better. Alright. Hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you on the next one. Be safe in the galaxy. Bye bye.